What's up, everybody? I'm George Kors, and let's talk about Thomas Pynchon's V. I promised the channel that maybe I would do a Pynchon deep dive, and I thought V would be a great initial deep dive for us to do because I think that it is a great introduction to Pynchon's work. And if you are aspiring out there to read Gravity's Rainbow, you want something maybe to get your feet wet with Pynchon's style, I think that V might be that novel for you. V is Pynchon's debut. It does retain most of that style that Pynchon has in Gravity's Rainbow. I think a lot of folks might also recommend Crying of Lot 49 as a good introduction to Pynchon's style of that time. I think V might be my pick, and the reason is because it's long enough that it lets the reader kind of get lost in the way that Pynchon wants you to get lost. So if you're looking forward to, say, reading Gravity's Rainbow, you want to try and get used to Pynchon's style, I think V is the better choice. Crying of Lot 49 is a worthy choice. It's a fantastic novel, but it's so short that you don't get sort of lost in the maze that Pynchon constructs. And to me, V is long enough that that is accomplished, that you're able to immerse yourself in a narrative enough to sort of get lost in it, which is something that Pynchon probably wants us to do, probably wants us to be a little lost. V itself, I think, in terms of the language that's here, is a really great introduction to how Pynchon writes a sentence and what's going on the page. Not just in terms of the plot kind of being thick and getting into the weeds of all the various characters, but how Pynchon constructs a sentence is something that I see time and time again kind of confounds readers. And to me, one of the things about the postmodernists that separates them from the modernists is that in a lot of really engaging and famous modernist novels, we see the author or the writer teaching the reader how to read it. And I see this with like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce as great examples of this, is like getting used to the sort of cadence that they have. The postmodernists do this in their own way, but I don't think with Gravity's Rainbow, for example, I don't know that you get as much time, to sort of get used to the style. It just is there. That might sound a little nebulous to you, but just work with me here for a second. We're getting used to a style of a person's sentence structure, the kind of vocabulary they use, the kind of lexicon that they use, and there are some conventions in there that you might notice with a particular writer that if you pay close attention to language, you might notice how they use adjectives in a particular way, for example, or in the case of Kafka, how they use punctuation in a certain way, for example. And I think V is a really great introduction to the sort of linguistic conventions that Pynchon is using in Gravity's Rainbow, for example. It's very much of that same era of Pynchon's work, and Pynchon's later work to me is pretty separate. After Gravity's Rainbow, there's an extended break in Pynchon's publications, and there's not a publication again until I think 1990, with the exception of the short story collection Slow Learner. In 1990, we have Vineland, which in and of itself is a novel that I think is a super fun romp, and I think that's what V is for me. V to me is a really fun kind of romp, and I think if you've read any Pynchon, there's just so much like weird quirky humor going on there that I think can be really very American, very fun, for Americans to read this, and a really interesting peek into American culture for folks who aren't from the United States. Pynchon is just one of those voices for me who is so deeply American. There's something in the way that Pynchon views the world. It's almost like viewing a world through a television, and that lens is just so deeply rooted in the culture of the United States for me that that I think, that maybe that's one of the reasons why Pynchon's so famous. So overall, I think V would be a really good introduction for you into the writing style, the sentences on the page. The other way that I think it's a great introduction to the writing style, I commented on a little bit up top, which is that it's long enough for you to sort of get lost with all the characters. One of the things that's like the hallmark of a Pynchon novel for me is that you are introduced to a side character, you experience a little bit of their own adventure, and you probably lose sight of who would be considered the main character. There is a more straightforward main character here than in other novels, but you do definitely sort of go down the rabbit hole with the side characters, which is a very, very Pynchonian experience. And to my taste, V is a great way to get used to that sort of narrative style where we lose track of the main protagonists, if we can assign one. We lose track of that main protagonist for sake of engaging in another person's story. And that person's story may or may not be relevant. So one of the things, as an introduction to Pynchon that I would encourage you to consider here as a reader is something I've talked about on the channel before, mainly regarding your reading comprehension. I think folks might read Pynchon and read the funky sentences and not immediately understand the funky sentence and get immediately dissuaded. Oh, I'm not understanding this. I don't know what's going on. And that could be frustrating. Why is Pynchon doing this? We just get wrapped up in all these questions. Just press the pause button for a second. Keep reading. Let yourself get used to it. Like I said with the modernists, we need to teach ourselves to read these objects sometimes. And it can be tough. It takes time to get there. But that's what's worthy about engaging in art, is illuminating, these ideas through that experience, through that mediated experience of reading a novel. It can take time to get used to a person's cadence. Take it easy on yourself. Give yourself some grace. If you're new to Pynchon, just take a deep breath. Keep going. If you want to stop and think about it, you should. Of course, that's the hallmark of a critical reader right there, is saying I'm gonna stop and contemplate what I just read here. But don't beat yourself up too much. A reading might not be authoritative, and there's so much going on. It's a cacophony usually in a Pynchon novel, particularly in my opinion in the first three, before his prolonged break for the second half of his career after 1990. And even those works, even Vineland, for example, which is one of his most contentious novels and is not necessarily beloved in the Pynchon community by any long stretch, even that has such a cacophonous way of going about it. And I would say one really great way to think about this is through just how many of those voices. I would talk a lot about on the channel about polyphony, and in a novel like War and Peace, for example, or Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, for example, where we have a historical telling. There's a separate sort of anthropological side to that categorizes those voices and lets you sort of get into the mode of understanding everybody's commentary on one specific thing. Pynchon and the way that the narrative arc goes in V, for example, nobody knows who V is. V's the subject of obsession for one of the characters that spans decades and decades and is just the subject of mystery and confusion. In that particular circumstance, the polyphony can be really weird. And I would encourage you to think about it. A good friend of mine said this about Pynchon. I thought it was very insightful, which is through, like I said, the lens of television. Think about it like flipping channels. Think about it like going through radio stations or, streaming, whatever the algorithm tells you on Netflix or Spotify or whatever. You're going from thing to thing to thing. This is part of the modern condition in the consumption of media, and something that Pynchon does really well. And those characters can be like switching the channel on television to a new show. So give yourself a little bit of grace there to understand that Pynchon might change what's going on really quickly, And that might be something that might not be your favorite, because if you're really reliant on a straightforward narrative, you're really plot focused, that could be difficult. But challenge yourself. Push yourself past that plot focus for a second. Appreciate what's going on. And these like little mini narratives that pop up are really well done in Pynchon. Pynchon does a really great job of, constructing a little tiny little bit of a narrative. Oh, that's over here, that has some commentary, a little narrative over there, some funky characters throughout all of that. Definitely something that is worthy of being introduced to, and is definitely why Pynchon's famous. Another thing, and I don't know, the pagination is the same on all editions. Mine is a real old Bantam books that this was published even before Gravity's Rainbow. This particular edition was printed before Gravity's Rainbow, so I don't know, because it just says by the author of Crying of Lot 49 on here. So it's pretty old. So I don't know if the pagination is the same, if the page numbers are the same. But one thing, another further introduction to Pynchon that's really good here is like these songs slash poems that are way ubiquitous throughout, like Gravity's Rainbow, for example, but ubiquitous in other books as well, that Pynchon uses time and time again. This is really silly stuff, and I think for me, one of the things when I came to V, the first Pynchon I read, I dove into the deep end, read Gravity's Rainbow first, then I read Crying of Lot 49, I read Vineland, and I read V just because I was interested to see what the debut was like, where his style was at initially. And you can definitely, I will say, you definitely see those gears turning in Pynchon's head as a writer when it comes to the style that eventually is exercised in Gravity's Rainbow. So really great introductory work here to the guy who's really famous from the 20th century. One of if not the most famous 20th century American man writer. And overall, with this novel, it is a romp. I mean, it is really. Most of Thomas Pynchon's novels are kind of like a romp to me. There's so much appropriation of television, and I keep referring to television, but the style of TV and how procedurally TV comedy is written, and also mystery stuff and detective stuff as well is really big in Pynchon's style. And to me, V has that feeling of kind of silliness throughout, that straddles that line. It's more silly than it is serious, but there's definitely some serious underlying themes throughout, that can be something that could be really exciting for you to get at as a reader. I think some of the things that were really silly in this novel, and I'm not going to try and summarize it, because I think V does a pretty decent job of being so cacophonous, of being so loud and weird, that it does defy, like many novels, a good synopsis. And we're not a recap channel, so we're not going to do that anyways. But some things that I thought were really funny and interesting throughout all of it. It's like some of the characters go have a job alligator hunting in the sewers of Manhattan. This sort of like American mythology stuff is something that Thomas Pynchon's really interested in throughout his writing, and we see stuff like that. A lot of Americans hear as a kid, oh yes, there's alligators in the sewer, and then Pynchon's playing with that at times. There's just all sorts of brawls, all sorts of bar brawls, or fights at parties, and just really raucous, weird behavior. The songs, again, we see these songs over and over again, these songs/poems where folks are singing. And the big two things that are really interesting for me are, one, a lot of weirdo characters, which I love about Pynchon. Pynchon has a really interesting naming convention for most characters, where he just names people weird things. One of our main sort of protagonists here is Benny Profane. That's just a really fun name for me. Rachel Owlglass, that's a fun name. Stencil, that's a fun name. These are really exciting and weird names, and that weirdness goes into how the character develops. We have this broader cast of characters. I think, Profane might be one of our main focuses. Stencil for sure is a main focus, and Owlglass, those three might be some of the main focus we get throughout the novel. But we have this whole entire group called the Whole Sick Crew. You just run into all sorts of weird, kooky characters. And I think that, to me, if you're having trouble, sort of grappling with how understandable a pension novel is, I think, to me, one of the great ways to sort of pause and give yourself grace is just to like look at the little mini character studies of these weirdo characters throughout the novel. That's a strategy I would also take with me to Gravity's Rainbow. If Gravity's Rainbow was really confounding me and I was having a lot of trouble with that, I would just look to the little weirdo characters throughout, their weird names, the weird actions that they take, the bizarre motivations that they have. It's just really strange and cool stuff. And I think it's one of those things that it makes, for me, Pension all the more approachable, is by understanding, hey, I'm going to run into some funky, strange characters. I'm going to leave the main character behind for sure, and I'm probably going to get these like weird tangents aside, and it's going to be sort of up to me to determine the importance of that tangent and see where it really fits into the narrative here. I think you could spend, just like any novel, you could spend a really significant amount of time splitting hairs here, but you want to read the whole thing. You want to delve into the whole thing. So the weirdo characters are one of the things that I really love about this novel, and I really like the weirdo characters in Gravity's Rainbow as well. I also really like the weirdo characters in Vineland, but that is what it is. Vineland's, like I said, really contentious. I thought it was a good novel. The second thing that I think is really interesting here is who is V, and one of the aspects of this novel that's really cool is V is this sort of mystery, this mysterious, strange character that comes from some sort of immemorial past, and it is the subject of focus of one of the characters. Stencil is obsessed with this multi-generation thing. Who is V? Asked time and time again, and Stencil is obsessive about this. And to me, that, V, it's no spoiler to say that V is not tidily resolved. Who V is not tidily resolved for our readers. That's sort of the journey we're going on, the journey into the unknown here. I think that is really cool. I thought that was really fun and exciting. Looking at my copy, one thing that's interesting about it is I think my copy's cover art is really dour. It looks really, really like serious, and this is not the tone of the novel. This art is not necessarily the tone of the novel. As Stencil sort of goes mad looking for V, it is really silly. I think there's a lot of silliness there. Of course, like I said, there's that blend of seriousness there. But overall, for me, it skews more on the silly side, as a lot of Pynchon's work does. There were some aspects here that were more serious. So, Profane and Stencil and Owlglass, they are interacting in the 1950s. They have that really discreet Americana 1950s vibe to them, which is something that is not so popular in media anymore. But it makes me think of like Back to the Future, the first Back to the Future movie. I don't know, that seems like it's set in the 1950s for me, and I might be wrong, but it has that really distinct Americana vibe, that really distinct post-war Americana vibe, and that is where we see our characters in the present tense interacting, and they then are sort of counterposed with these historical flashbacks, and there aren't that many historical flashbacks, but there's enough for it to merit a mention. The historical flashbacks are where we get a lot of the V symbolism and sort of the mystery surrounding the character of V. Lots of words starting with V. That's one of those things. Pay attention to words that start with V throughout the narrative. That's going to help you sort of dig into, okay, this mystery surrounding the character of V, who she is. And those historical flashbacks go from like the 19th century up through the early 20th century. There's like Florence, Italy. One that I thought was really interesting for Pynchon was the Herero Wars, these colonial these like colonial battles that were happening as part of the colonial project in southwestern Africa. I was really surprised to see that. And then also we have situations in Malta around like the Suez Crisis. Um, and those that sort of bouncing back and forth in the intergenerational perspective of things is really interesting. Did remind me of Vineland, but Vineland has it on a smaller scale where it's not quite as large. But it was really interesting to me to see those historical flashbacks. I wouldn't categorize this as historical fiction at all, which is interesting because the Herero Wars stuff kind of gets a little close to that. That stuff was definitely on the more serious side of tone, and I was really surprised by that. But it all sort of blends together into this: who is V, and how is the whole sick crew on this greater sort of almost conspiratorial historical journey to find who V is. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Um, Now, those historical flashbacks, I think that they do interweave relatively well for the reader. I think one of the things I would say there, though, I've mentioned this a bunch of times, is it's easy to get lost in a Pynchon novel. And I think that one of the reasons why I'd recommend V as a good introduction for you if you're a new Pynchon reader is because it's good to experience that getting lost, because the kind of intertextual getting lostness that happens in Gravity's Rainbow is so much more pronounced than in V that it might be good to get used to it if that's not really something that you're familiar with here. And the way that I would say that is with both the historical flashbacks and with the focus in the 1950s on the whole sick crew and Benny Profane in the United States, there are so many references that and that's something that Pynchon's really famous for, is referencing pop culture stuff. And in Gravity's Rainbow, there's so much of it, this like really bizarre American references to even stuff earlier than the Second World War. But here we get a really good introduction to that. There is a website that I'll recommend that has various annotations to this, so I'll drop that down below for you folks. That way you can have a resource for annotations to sort of parse through some of those references. But getting lost in those references and how what is referenced in terms of pop culture and history in the flashbacks versus what is referenced in pop culture and history in the present tense of Benny Profane, that can get pretty in the weeds. It can get pretty complicated. And to me, this is a really great way to be introduced to that. Because that's something that Pynchon does as well all the time. Pynchon is all the time doing all sorts of intertextual referencing. And V is no stranger to that. Profane, as a character, Profane is immediately referred to as a Schlemiel, the human yo-yo. Schlemiel is a really interesting concept that I think is important to the narrative here, particularly just because I think what a Schlemiel is as like an unlucky person, a person who does not have luck, that is really interesting to me when looking at Benny Profane. And just seeing, what happens in the narrative. So one of the ways that you might have a more focused read in V is just thinking about things in terms of that status of being a Schlemiel, being a person who does not have luck. And this phrase, this noun Schlemiel, comes from some popular folklore from Europe of Peter Schlemiel, which is like this 19th century tale of Peter Schlemiel, where Peter Schlemiel basically sells his soul for an unlimited, or sells his shadow. I'm sorry, sells his shadow for a bag of unlimited gold, but then just gets made fun of and chastised for not having a shadow. Like, oh, Peter's weird, he doesn't have a shadow, but him having ultimately infinite riches is of no benefit, right? And that, I think, I thought it was really interesting to categorize Benny Profane as a Schlemiel right off the bat, as this unlucky person. a person without a shadow. And I thought I think that's a really great way for you to maybe, have a more concrete reading of some of the stuff that's going on here, especially if we want to consider reading Pynchon as, a way to, do these little character studies of all these weirdo characters. Paying attention to the luck aspect of Benny Profane is really cool. Stencil is the character that we have that is obsessed with V. That's sort of who introduces V's narrative and why V is important and who is V and tries to sort all of that out. And it just overall, the trajectory of it from, Benny Profane being introduced to being in Manhattan and hunting alligators as a job and just not being able to hold a job down and everybody living this weird bohemian life in the 1950s. That I think it's fun to engage in, and like I one of the themes that I've been talking about a lot throughout this episode is sort of Americana. To me, Pynchon is so deeply American, is so the voice just is really, really American to me. And while Pynchon is one of the 20th century's most famous experimental novelists, for sure, I think Pynchon's voice just is really, really captures that Americana of the 1950s. And that's throughout his writing. You just get these weird little pop culture references, little corporate references throughout most of his works. And Pynchon likewise captures that conspiratorial nature that a lot of Americans have. And V is no exception to that. V is a mystery. Who she is a mystery. Who they are is a mystery. I'll say they actually for V. And that really does speak to this conspiratorial feeling that Pynchon has that I think to me is a hallmark of this wholesome idea that was sold to a lot of white Americans about the 1950s is covering up this larger society that is experiencing all of these obvious social problems and the development of the suburbs, for example, the development of like corporate obsession and pop culture. All of these things are sort of glossing over a much more complicated and diverse society. And I think V and Gravity's Rainbow to an extent and some of Pynchon's other work really gets into that sort of conspiratorial nature of Americans and how that's intertwined with our like beloved pop culture. For folks who aren't from the United States, I think reading a Pynchon novel like V that is primarily set in the United States is actually probably a really insightful way to look at how Americans deal with pop culture. Pop culture is placed almost on a bizarre pedestal in the United States of America, and we have a deeply unhealthy relationship with it. And we develop these weird mythologies around it, and Pynchon is delving into those mythologies. I keep coming back to the hunting the alligators in the sewers. It's completely stupid, like American mythology, right? But it's so entrenched in who we are in our society and just the weird stories that we've built up. I think it's really important. And I would say a really great novel for our feelings about pop culture to look at would be Vineland as well. I think Vineland also has a lot of those weird references. But to me, the way that Pynchon references all sorts of pop culture, one of the major ones in this novel is Kilroy Was Here, which is for most folks, completely antiquated, like World War II era pop culture reference that just absolutely is not relevant anymore. But this is showing this sort of greater nature of pop culture referencing in the United States and the way, that Kilroy Was Here is referenced in here. There are all sorts of myriads of pop culture references right now that you can run into that are just as ephemeral as Kilroy Was Here that people get sort of obsessed with in the United States. And to me, Pynchon is a really great writer for reflecting on just how pervasive that pop culture mentality is. Overall, I think V is an interesting novel. I would really recommend it as an introduction to Thomas Pynchon. Like I said, and I hope I've made this clear. If you are out there having trouble with Gravity's Rainbow, I think giving V a shot first is probably a decent enough idea, because to my taste, Crying of Lot 49 just isn't long enough for you to get lost in. And here the threads are myriad. There's so many different little weird characters. There's so many different little weird historical references or places in time that you're taken to. Trying to connect the dots between Benny Profane hunting alligators in Manhattan in the 1950s to the Suez Crisis in Malta, to Florence in the late 19th century, these to the Herero Wars in the Colonialist Project. We're almost trying to read the stars with some of this stuff, and that's part of the fun of it. Part of the fun is thinking through what exactly is going on here. To me, I'm seeing this weird bohemian romp where these post-war, some of them World War II veterans, but these like post-war sort of dropout type characters are much more deeply connected to a greater and grander world history than they anticipate. And V is this sort of untenable, unfindable, thematic throughout all of that. And I don't think those are spoilers. I think that is just my take on what is this journey that Benny Profane's taking? What is this journey that Rachel Owlglass is taking? How is that all relevant and tied together? And one thing that I see by having this large list of characters over the 16 chapters here is they are connected to this broader and grander scheme of world history. And V represents some of those mysteries of that world history to me. Some of the mystery and some of the allure as well. V definitely is often portrayed as a woman. And there's a lot of sort of sexual content with V as well. So I think overall it's a great sort of mysterious romp. And if you like novels that are set in America in the 1950s, I think that is reasonable for you to pick up V and take a look at it. The 1950s are kind of a miss time for me. I'm not super jazzed to read a novel set in the 1950s. I think part of that is because I don't super like that Americana, that generation of it from like the 40s through the 50s and a lot of the pop culture there. It is not for me. I'm not super excited about it. For example, I'm not reading, I don't read a lot of the beats. A lot of the beat material is kind of off my radar, with the exception of arguably one of these books, although that's contentious. We'll get to that in a second. But V was pretty good for me. I did enjoy it, and I wasn't too upset by the sort of time frame setting, the 1950s setting. Let's talk about some recommended novels, because I think obviously I've recommended reading Gravity's Rainbow here, but I'm not going to recommend it because everybody recommends Gravity's Rainbow. So let's talk about some other novels. A romp, but in the bad way, would be Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. There's a lot of drunken revelry in V, where a lot of characters are just doing stupid crap while running around a town drunk. There's a great scene where they're running around DC drunk and going to these different parties and doing stupid stuff. And Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry is one of those novels that's a romp in the bad way, where our protagonist here is running around drunk and in the bad sense. So that sensibility is here, and it has a little bit of that mid-century vibe that you get in V as well. Another recommendation that I have that is based off of this idea of Benny Profane being a schlemiel is one that directly deals, and this is a more contemporary novel that is also very experimental. This is a collage novel that is called Exiled Shadow by Norman Manea. And this novel is really interesting because of the way that the narrative is structured in terms of it's almost a blend of fiction and nonfiction. It's a fiction. It's almost autofiction. And this deals deeply with this idea of the Schlemiel of Peta Schlemiel, and I think as a contemporary novel, it's pretty overlooked. I think this one is good though. I think this novel is really good. I have sort of mixed feelings on the writing style. It can come off as a little arrogant at times in the text. Um, that said, I thought it was pretty compelling, and it's definitely a novel I've been thinking about a lot since I read it. And then I've got one last novel to recommend here, which I said this is, in my opinion, I think this era of Gaddis is a beat. I think he was interfacing with the beats enough to say that the Recognitions by William Gaddis is a beat novel. That's going to be a controversial one. But in my opinion, I think what's happening here is of the beat generation. So I took a lot of notes in this guy. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. This is a more recent Dalkey edition. It's huge. It's really, really thick. I think it might be almost 1,000 pages in length. This is also a really polyphonic novel, and I think what Gaddis is doing, when Pynchon first came out, some folks speculated, is he Salinger, is he Gaddis? There was a lot of weird speculation. We don't get a lot of weird speculation like that anymore in the literary scene. But and that maybe that's why Pynchon is this real mysterious character for us in America. But going back to the Recognitions, it's really polyphonic, and I think it has really cool stuff going on. Just in terms of what the characters get up to, but the weird bohemian revelry aspects are major in the Recognitions, and I think that you feel them throughout V as well, which is interesting. If you have read Gravity's Rainbow, that's definitely a very different vibe. So those are my recommendations here. I think V, overall is a pretty worthy novel, as a debut. I think it's pretty well done. The sentences are pretty good. I think Thomas Pynchon does a good job writing sentences. And there's just that overwhelming silliness for me, and that it's really deeply American. I can't reiterate that enough. That some writers really capture that pop culture feeling. And Pynchon strangely does it very well. So definitely a worthy entry point for Pynchon. Or if you've read Gravity's Rainbow and you're looking for something else, I definitely felt like I was reading a little bit of a primer almost in the style of Gravity's Rainbow here. So tons and tons of stuff going on, and like I said, I think William Gaddis, the Recognitions, is definitely another one of those novels that has that same feeling, that same Americana feeling, and that's not necessarily for everybody. I would say these are two of the novels that are set from that sort of bohemian American post-war era that I can get behind. The Recognitions has its own, it's 1,000 pages long, so there's so much going on there that merits its own sort of analysis video, of course. But I think that era, because I don't deal with it so much, it's nice to occasionally get into a novel there that really actually doesn't put me off. Because that early post-war period, I don't know what it is. If you like the beats, for example, or if you like a lot of 1950s literature, could you comment down below and tell me what to start with? Because a lot of it I really passed on. I think I read like the first 30 pages of Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. I gave the novel away. I couldn't even read it. It just wasn't. The voice, I think, is really weird for me, and I don't know. It doesn't really speak to me, and I don't know why that is. I haven't thought about it. I haven't thought about the 1950s American writers much as some crew that I should be dealing with. Now, of course, I love Ginsberg, but I don't know. Kerouac and the others, I just haven't really given them the time. It seems icky and weird to me, but I'm sure one of you folks out there watching really loves it. So let me know. down below what from the 1950s I should read, because this was one of those one of the rare books that's set in that era that I was like pretty okay with. So let me know if you're going to read this. If you've read it, let me know what your opinion is. You know, I think it's a fun, silly read, and I enjoyed it. I had fun reading it. It definitely made me want to reread Gravity's Rainbow, which maybe I'll do this year. I don't know. I've heard some chatter on the internet of some folks doing a Gravity's Rainbow read. Maybe I'll do it. Thank you all for spending some time with me today. I really, really appreciate it. It means a lot to me as a writer, as an author, to have folks watching these videos. So please like and subscribe. Thank you so much. And of course, the next thing you need to do is read my novel, Always the Wanderer. This should be on your to be read list for sure. Very, of course, it's my work. It's great. And if you want to find out more about me, you can head to georgekouros.com to find out more about me as a writer and thinker and professor and all that stuff. And you can follow me on socials that I may or may not use at gbk7288. And thank you so much, folks. I hope you enjoy your reading. I hope your reading practice is going well, and stay safe out there. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next video. Thanks a lot.